We are doing our third lesson today on defensive apologetics. Today we're going to be talking about the problem of evil. The problem of evil is the most successful argument against atheism, against Christianity, that is. It is the number one reason to this day that people say they do not believe in God, and it's the number one reason people leave Christianity. As always, I want to start off with this quote by my professor, Dr. Jeffrey Robinson. He says that we could say that apologetics is the art of loving people by addressing their questions in an intellectually rigorous yet gentle and respectful manner. And when we do apologetics, we are not trying to truth bomb people or make people look stupid. We're trying to open up someone to the idea of believing in God or becoming a Christian or things along those lines, or you're trying to encourage other Christians and things like that. So we don't want to do it in an unchristlike way because it's ministry. First thing we're going to be looking at is called the Epicurus paradox. Now I have to correct myself because I misspoke as we were talking about the different arguments against God's existence. I said that there was an argument called the Euthyphro dilemma. And remember, I couldn't remember what it was called. I said, this is actually a very old idea. I was talking about ideas that were used over and over and over again, and they were so old and so antiquated and so thoroughly defeated so many times that they were hard to take serious. As an example of that, I gave you the problem of evil, I said, which originated with Euthyphro. But I was wrong about that. I got my ancient Greek philosophers mixed up. So what I was trying to get at, what I was thinking of, that I was having trouble remembering, was this guy, Epicurus. This is the first de facto objection that we're going to be looking at. These are the weakest arguments against Christianity because they're just really, really easy to deal with. And like I said, this argument in particular is kind of tiring. It's one of those things that atheists have kind of been regurgitating over and over and over and over and over again. And we correct it over and 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 over again. When I say this argument is old, it is old. Matter of fact, this argument is so old that it predates Christianity. And that's pretty old. It's pretty far back to get older than Christianity. So like I said, Epicurus, he's the one who came up with this. He lived from 341 BC to 270 BC. He wrote an immense amount of stuff. There was a guy named Diogenes, and you can see that in your handout. Diogenes said that Epicurus had written over 300 books. That's a lot. That's a lot today. That's even more when you consider that these guys were writing books by hand. Okay. So Epicurus, like I said, he was supposed to be one of the most prolific writers of the time. He was written about by a guy named Diogenes, who's also very old. He lived from 180 to 240. And Diogenes said that he had written over 300 books, Epicurus had. Unfortunately for us, and I guess really for anyone who's really interested in historical or intellectual things, Epicurus' stuff is completely gone almost. There's really nothing left of it. We have all these stories about all the stuff that he had written, but it's gone. Like I was saying, it is really impressive to have written 300 books. It's even more impressive when you consider that this guy was writing this stuff by hand with quill and parchment. So that is no joke. It's a lot of hard work to just kind of disappear on us. Mostly what we have of Epicurus is stuff that other people talked about. Somebody else writes about Epicurus. Somebody else quotes him. What we've done is put together people talking about him, and we got an idea of what he believed, what he taught. What's kind of interesting here is that Epicurus himself was not an atheist, but his most famous argument is this. It's called the Epicurus or the Epicurus paradox. And Epicurus was a hedonist, and so he believed that you should basically be living your best life now, and that you should just be enjoying yourself and having a good time and all that stuff. And he had a problem with the way that people were afraid of the gods. That really bothered him, that people were not living for pleasure because they were afraid that the gods might judge them. And so he kind of came up with this argument here. Like I said, we don't really have the argument itself. The earliest reference that I could find to the Epicurus paradox was from a guy named Lucius Lactantius. That is a good baby name if you're looking for baby names. He lived from 240 to 320 AD, and he wrote a series of works called the Divine Institutes. He was a Christian, and he brings up Epicurus' paradox in that little series there. Now, according to David Hume, which might be the most well-known rendering of the Epicurus paradox, he allegedly quotes Epicurus, David Hume does, and this is how he quotes him. He says, "Is he willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil?" And so you can kind of see the problem here that Epicurus had with the gods. If the gods were so good, then how is it that that human suffering existed? I would say that it really seems doubtful to me that Epicurus actually said this, or it's at least doubtful that Epicurus said this way. A couple of reasons why we can know that immediately is that Epicurus was a polytheist and had no concept of monotheism. He would have not said God, he would not have said he would have said them. He would not have been talking about the God, the one true God, because he didn't know who the one true God was. He was born, he actually died hundreds of years before Jesus was born. He had no concept of Christianity. He most certainly was not attacking Christianity, like David Hume is kind of using the argument to do. The argument probably did not come from Epicurus, or it most definitely was not said like this. And secondly, obviously, if you're a polytheist, you're not an atheist. As a non-atheist, he was not trying to prove the gods didn't exist. He was trying to say you shouldn't be afraid of the gods, you shouldn't be worried about the gods. His argument was that the gods just did not care about you and that they weren't really interested in our lives and you should do whatever it is that you want to do. Now, this seems to be, whether or not Epicurus actually came up with this, a contradiction in the Christian idea of God. And this is what makes it a de facto argument against God. If I told you I was the color purple, and you looked at me and you saw that I was in fact not the color purple, you'd be able to prove that I had lied. And that's the idea. That if Christianity says something, and I can look up and see that with my own eyes and common sense, that what Christianity is saying is not true, then I've proven that Christianity isn't true. That's the idea here. Is there a contradiction in the Bible's claims about God and Christianity's claims about God? And it seems to be a pretty serious contradiction because the Bible, in no uncertain terms, teaches that God is all-powerful, which we use that word omnipotent, that he is all-knowing, or omniscient, and that he is all-good, which is our word omnibenevolent that we use in theology a lot. The Epicurus paradox points out that a contradiction exists between what the Bible says is true, that God is all-powerful and he's all-good and he's all-knowing, and what we know is true, that evil exists and people suffer and terrible things happen every day. We know that evil and suffering exist, and so wouldn't it be obvious to us that the Bible is wrong? Again, think about what Epicurus is saying here. Is he willing to prevent evil but not able? If God is willing to prevent evil, he wants to prevent evil, but he's not able to do it, or maybe he doesn't know about it, then he's not omnipotent like the Bible says he is. So you can't use that excuse. Maybe he is able, he's omnipotent, he's all-powerful, but he's just not willing. That God doesn't care that you're suffering. He doesn't care that people get sick, people get cancer, that babies get cancer, that children in third world countries die of parasites, that God just doesn't care. He could save them, he doesn't want to because he just doesn't care. Well, if that's true, then God is evil. And again, we have a contradiction in the Bible. Now, you could say that God is all-powerful and all-good and all-knowing, like Christianity does. But if we chose to believe that, then whence is evil? Why does evil exist? So there seems to be a problem here with the Christian claim of God. And the way that the Epicurus paradox looks at it If God's just not powerful enough to stop all the evil, then Christianity is wrong. If God is strong enough, but he just doesn't care, then Christianity is wrong. And if you say that God is both all-powerful and caring, then Christianity is wrong because we're surrounded by evil, right? So this seems to be a pretty condemning idea. It seems to be like, oh man, we're in big trouble here. You're probably already able, as I'm saying these things, to point out some problems with this type of thinking. And the problem is the type of stuff that the paradox is leaving out, that the paradox is missing something. The Epicurus paradox is guilty of being something called a straw man argument. Okay, and that is from a Rulebook for arguments. You can see the quotation there. And it's also in your handout. A straw man argument is a caricature of an opposing view that is exaggerated from what anyone is likely to hold so that it is easy to refute. That's how the definition is worded there. What that means, real simply, is that I come up with an idea that is totally crazy that no one believes, and I say, that's what Miss Karen believes. Isn't Miss Karen crazy? And the reality is, that's not what you actually believe, right? I make up my own version of what you believe that is way over the top and obviously not true. It's easy to defeat it, to debunk it. And so the Epicurus paradox does not address what Christians actually believe about God. A couple of big points there is that it's not just true that God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent and omniscient in those things. God is also just, which means God judges evil. There's also the matter of the doctrine of sin, which is a huge foundational part of Christian theology. And the doctrine of sin teaches us that the reason there is suffering in the world is because people are evil. And the Epicurus paradox doesn't bring that to bear. So it's actually really easy to debunk, and it's been debunked many, many, many times, because all you have to say is, that's not what Christians believe about God. What we believe is that there's something called sin, and people suffer because of sin, and God, though He's all-powerful and all-good, He is also just, and He is just to allow suffering because of the presence of sin. And that's why that there is suffering in the world. And it's really not a difficult argument. I bet you if I went into the room, I could probably get one of the kiddos and bring them in here. And I know my 8-year-old, because I've had this conversation with him, could answer this question. There's probably, I bet you Ronan's 5. Ronan, if we gave him enough time, I bet you could come up with this response here. Yeah, but wait a minute, don't we suffer because of sin? It's a very basic core part of Christian teaching, something we're taught as children in a Sunday school class. Adam and Eve sinned. And because Adam and Eve sinned, there's suffering in the world. So this isn't really a very challenging argument. What it does, like I said, is it creates a straw man argument. It gets rid of an entire area of theology. It ignores an entire area of theology and instead just makes this argument that's kind of a halfway argument. It's not really dealing with what Christians believe. But regardless of that, the problem of evil remains the number one reason, like we said, that people say they don't believe in God. So as we look through history, this doesn't get much done. Christianity continues happily along, regardless of the Epicurus paradox. And so atheists, they kind of cling to it, and it's like it's almost a good argument. Like if we could work on it a little bit, if we could tweak it a little bit, we could make it good because it's just almost there. It doesn't quite do it, but it's just right on the edge of being just an unbeatable argument. And so people continue to try to rework this. In order for the Epicurus paradox to succeed, they have to prove that there's a contradiction between biblical Christianity and human suffering. That is a de facto claim. And so the onus is on the atheist, not the Christian, to come up with, to prove that this is the case, to prove that there's a contradiction. They work really hard to try to come up with something that they could add to this argument to make it to where it works, but they never really were able to do that because there are many reasons why God would allow evil. A few of those reasons are that God allows suffering to bring about a greater good. God allows suffering as an act of judgment. God allows evil as a side effect of free will, and we could probably go on as we thought about these things. Sometimes suffering happens because of Satan, sometimes suffering happens because of demons, and so on and so on. As they clung to this over time, they may come up with various kind of reimagined, reinvented sort of ways to make this argument work. And this went along until a guy named William Rowe came onto the scene. Dr. William Rowe is was, I would say, a prominent atheist professor. He lived from 1931 and died in actually 2015, really not that long ago. And he published 2 articles on the subject of suffering. The first article was titled "The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism." And you've probably heard of that before. I think I've mentioned that before. That was in 1979. And then later he wrote another paper called "The Evidential Argument from Evil, a Second Look," and that was written in 1996. Now, both of these arguments say that because evil exists, it is more probable than not that God doesn't exist. There's a big problem with this statement. It is more probable than not that God doesn't exist. Anybody want to take a stab at that? What's the problem with that?
Just because it's not probable doesn't mean it's not true.
That's exactly right. Something can be very, very unlikely and still be true. So it's still a pretty weak argument. But this is his argument, and I took this from The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism, and this is how he makes his argument. He makes it in a series of premises, and they kind of look like a math problem. It's like 1 + 2 = 3, basically, is the way the argument. So it says, number 1, there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Hey, there's another reason God would allow evil, right? To prevent some other evil that's even worse, okay? Number 2, an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Number 3, therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. Now, to demonstrate the truth of this, Rowe gives this argument. Okay, he says, suppose in some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. So far as we can see, the fawn's intense suffering is pointless, for there does not appear to be any greater good such that the prevention of the fawn's suffering would require either the loss of that good or the occurrence of an evil equally bad or worse. Nor does there seem to be any equally bad or worse evil so connected to the fawn's suffering that it would have had to occur had the fawn's suffering been prevented. Could an omnipotent, omniscient being have prevented the fawn's apparently pointless suffering? The answer is obvious, as even the theist will insist. An omnipotent, omniscient being could have easily prevented the fawn from being horribly burned, or, given the burning, could have spared the fawn the intense suffering by quickly ending its life, rather than allowing the fawn to lie in terrible agony for several days. Since the fawn's suffering was preventable, and so far as we can see, pointless, doesn't it appear that premise 1 of the argument is true, that there do exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. I think one of the biggest weaknesses of Rowe's argument, this argument from evil, is that it is not a de facto argument. Now, remember the difference between de facto and de jure? The de facto argument is saying we've proven that Christianity is wrong. And this is not a de facto argument. This is a de jure argument. He's saying we've proven that it's probably wrong, but we can't be sure. That is a very, very different thing to say. And it's really important to remember this, that he has abandoned using the argument of evil to say that he has proven that God doesn't exist. But that's huge. Because what that is William Rowe and other atheists acknowledging that the problem of evil does not disprove Christianity. So they stopped doing that, and they had to come up with a new way to attack the problem. As a matter of fact, William Rowe himself openly recognized that his formula did not prove that atheism was true. And so this is Rowe continuing about a paragraph later in the same article. He says, it must be acknowledged that the case of the Fawn's apparently pointless suffering does not prove that one is true. Doesn't prove that his premise is true. For even though we cannot see why the Fawn's suffering is required to obtain some greater good, or to prevent some equally bad or worse evil, it hardly follows that it is not so required. After all, we are often surprised by how things we thought to be unconnected turn out to be intimately connected. So Rowe is willing to recognize, listen, there's a lot of stuff we just don't know. And maybe there was a good reason for the Fawn to suffer, and we just don't know about it. And so he says this, because of that, we can't use this argument, we can't use suffering to prove that God doesn't exist. Modern atheist scholars have long since given up using the problem of evil to say that Christianity is false. And this is really important because it is the number one reason that people will tell you they don't believe that God exists. But when you get among academics, you get among scholarly atheists, they don't use this argument anymore. It is old hat. It is debunked. It is false. It is not true. It is not successful. And this has been proven over and over and over again over a period of 2,000 years. We have dealt with this argument and dealt with it well. Even in the earliest writings of the Christian faith, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, it has shown, the Bible has dealt and shown us how the problem of evil gels, if you will, with the Christian faith. Even before Christianity existed in the Old Testament, we were able to see there was suffering in the world and how that suffering goes hand in hand with an all-powerful God. This line of thinking is only used by ignorant or uneducated individuals who don't understand their own argument. This is really important to remember. I think this is probably the most important point we'll make in this lesson, because what the number one thing you're going to hear from people is not what William Rowe said, it's what Epicurus said. If God is so good, why do bad things happen to good people? It's good to know whenever somebody attacks your faith like this, from this angle. Real atheists don't use this argument. And so remember that if you ever find yourself in a conversation here. And if you could remember, quote William Rowe. William Rowe himself, an atheist, writing an argument with the objective of disproving Christianity, said himself, this argument does not disprove Christianity. That's an important, I think, a really important point. And so instead, he comes up with a different way to address this. And like I said here, I kind of skipped over this, but this is just another de jure objection. It's not a de facto objection, and it doesn't prove anything at all. It tells us, remember, the difference is a de facto argument says we've proven that it's wrong. A de jure objection says you're crazy for believing this. And that's a very, very, very different statement. Okay, so this is just a de jure objection. William Rowe kind of repacked this, and you can see this quote. He says this was his conclusion about his argument. He said, in light of our experiences and knowledge of the variety and scale of human and animal suffering in our world, the idea that none of this suffering could have been prevented by an omnipotent being without thereby losing a greater good or permitting an evil at least as bad seems an extraordinary, absurd idea quite beyond our belief. We can think of a lot of gratuitous evil in the world. Gratuitous meaning meaningless, pointless evil. That we could sit around and we could talk about children that died from parasites and for absolutely no reason, for fawns that died in the forest for absolutely no reason. There's no excuse for this level of suffering in the world. It doesn't prove that God doesn't exist, and he recognizes this. He says, maybe there is some reason I don't know about that God allows this. But to believe that is so crazy. He says it is an extraordinary, absurd idea, quite beyond our belief. You would have to be, remember the de jure statement? You would have to be crazy to believe this is true. It doesn't prove anything. It's just a ridiculous idea. Like I said, because this is a de jure argument, it suffers from all the same weaknesses of other de jure arguments. And there's also, we already mentioned some of these, y'all guys pointed out, there's a series of wild assumptions that Rowe is making here. that we could probably pick apart. Rowe himself admits that we have no reason to believe that suffering is without rhyme or reason. And what Fawn is he talking about? Like, as far as we know, this has never happened. Nothing like this has ever happened. If some animal does suffer out in the wilderness and no one's there to see it, how do you know that God didn't show up and supernaturally help this animal? As far as you know, an angel showed up and carried the fawn's soul into heaven. You don't know what happened. You weren't there. How can you possibly account for something that you weren't there to witness? That's ridiculous and absurd. And as far as we know, in all of the history of the world, a fawn has never been trapped under a tree and burned badly and died 3 days later, however many days later he says it is. There's no evidence of this at all. It is just a wild story that he made up to try to make a point. There's no reason at all that we should take Rowe at his word. Now, one thing that I'll mention real quick before we move on and we make our defense is that Rowe's second attempt at this came in 1996 in a paper called The Evidential Argument from Evil, a Second Look. And he doesn't use the fawn's illustration this time. This time he used Bayes' theorem, and he came up with a very calculated and precise kind of equation to try to prove that Christianity wasn't true. I didn't add that to this because it is a lot. It's a lot. As a matter of fact, I talked about this second argument in my thesis, and I went over to my mother's and I said, hey, look at this argument. Do you think that we should include this? And she said, no, don't put that in there. So it is just a lot, okay? If you're interested in it, you can Google my thesis. It's called a two-part rebuttal. And you can just, matter of fact, what you could do is type in David Wilson, a two-part rebuttal. But ultimately, it was just the same exact argument. He goes way around the way to say it is more likely than not that God doesn't exist.
Using this big old huge equation.
If you want a detailed study on Bayes' theorem, leave a like and a comment.
It was like a massive geometry class.
It's a lot. It's a huge
If we get
equation.
50 likes on the video,
yeah, there we go.
we'll do a
50 likes, we'll do a lesson on it. Yeah. So anyway, so how do we make a defense? Remember, there are these two types of arguments, and we see both of them here. There's a de facto argument from evil, and there is a de jure argument from evil. Okay? There's also the emotional problem of evil, and I'm going to look at all three of these. Okay? The emotional problem of evil is not an argument against Christianity. It's kind of off in its own thing, and we'll deal with that too. But first, we're going to consider the de facto arguments from suffering, like we saw with the Epicurus paradox. As I point this out here, it's built on a logical fallacy. It's supposed to prove something, and it doesn't prove it. And so it's just not a very good argument. In order for the Epicurus paradox to work, they have to prove beyond some reasonable doubt that a contradiction exists between Christianity and the reality of suffering, and there is no contradiction, so the argument doesn't work. The Bible teaches us that God allows suffering on account of the sin curse, and he does sometimes intervene in suffering. How many of you believe that you have witnessed God intervene in some kind of suffering in your life? Pretty much everybody, right? There's probably been some time in your life where you're in the hospital or a loved one's in the hospital, and you began to pray for this person, and you saw God come to the rescue. And we all have stories like that. And so God sometimes does intervene with suffering and alleviate suffering, but he allows suffering at large as a consequence of mankind's rebellion. On a popular level, how the argument usually goes is if God is really good, if God is real, why do bad things happen to good people? The answer to that argument, or at least part of the answer, is that there are no good people. There's never been a bad thing that has ever happened to a good person, except for one, and he volunteered for it. And that was Jesus who died on the cross. That was the only time something bad happened to a good person. It's not the same thing as saying that because you sinned in 1992, now you have cancer. That's not how it works. Remember, some people challenged Jesus with that. They said they found a guy that was blind, and he says, hey, this guy's blind. Is it because of his sin that he's blind, or his parents' sin that he's blind? And Jesus basically, rebukes them and says, you don't know what you're talking about. This wasn't because of sin. There is a general curse of sin on all of creation. And it's not God necessarily picking on people, though that is one reason why you could suffer. but it's just the reality of suffering in our world at large because of sin. Now, there are a lot of other reasons why that we would say that that Epicurus is wrong to beyond this, but you only need one rebuttal. You see what I'm saying? Is he has to prove there is no excuse under any circumstance for God to allow evil in the world the way that he does. And all I have to do is provide one example, just one, of why God would allow evil and still be good. And the entire argument blows up. Now I only need one. But I have a lot more than one, don't I? There's a lot of reasons why God would allow suffering. For example, God uses suffering to alert us to our need for him. C.S. Lewis said that suffering was God's megaphone. That whenever we suffer, whenever we go through difficulty, that's something that drives us toward God. It lets us see that we need God's help and God's grace. These types of experiences bring about a greater good than we could really imagine. I remember a story that somebody gave one time of their daughter had died. Their daughter ran behind the car and they ran under the car. They ran over her and crushed her and killed her. She was like 3 years old. And it was just devastating. As they worked through this, and they worked through this by faith, and their Christianity really kind of came to the surface here, all of their friends and neighbors were watching this, and there were several households on their street that became Christians and gave their lives to Christ through the death of this little girl. And so when you think about somebody being saved, that is something that is eternal. It's eternal. So you have somebody who was going to spend the rest of eternity in a place called hell, and God allowed some type of suffering, some temporary suffering, and now this person is going to spend the rest of their eternity in heaven. What amount of suffering would not be worth that? When you think about Jesus' death on the cross, who knows how many people are going to be able to call heaven their home because Jesus unsparingly suffered some evil. What suffering is not worth that? It's not worth somebody going to heaven. If we talk about eternal consequences, any amount of suffering would be worth one person being able to be saved. But there are more answers than just that. The Apostle Paul said that I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. Sometimes we suffer because of our own actions. The reality is that you suffer because you're stupid sometimes, right? You suffer sometimes because of demonic and satanic oppression. You suffer sometimes because of the evil intent of somebody else in your life. You suffer sometimes because of some greater good, like Christ did on the cross. We could really go on and on and on here. We could think of a lot of reasons why God would allow suffering and it be okay. And so the question is this a contradiction? Does suffering prove that God doesn't exist? Of course it doesn't. This is a very weak, very empty, very silly argument. To move on to the de jure objection, what about Rowe's probability argument? This de jure objection that he said. And remember, all the de jure objection is going to say is that you aren't justified or warranted for believing in Christianity for some reason. Now here we could use that AC model. Do y'all remember that? And it basically talks about how that was the one that we looked at in the first lesson. That we don't need evidence, that we're perfectly justified in believing God the way we do. And this is not only true, this is obviously true, right? So we could use that objection here. We could counter with that. Because Christianity is warranted belief. It doesn't matter what the de jure objection is. Besides that, this is actually a really specific kind of de jure objection. It's a probability objection. And what's the problem with the probability? We already talked about that. Y'all remember the inside straight argument? Something can be really, really, really unlikely. It can still be true. That's right. Something can be really unlikely and still be true. And so we have that inside straight defense from Alvin Plantinga. And even if we granted the argument and we pretended like it was 100% correct, it still wouldn't prove that God doesn't exist because it is just a probability argument. I like to use atheism's own quotes against them. The idea that a Christian had some rich, spiritual, meaningful relationship with God. The idea that that person would give up their Christianity because William Rowe said that God probably doesn't exist is extraordinarily absurd and quite beyond our belief. We could also point out some problems with Rowe's argument itself. It suffers from the same weakness that the Epicurus paradox does. It's a straw man argument, which means that's a logical fallacy. It doesn't work. Roe is contending with his own made-up version of Christianity. We don't believe in the type of Christianity that Roe is attacking. So we believe in a version of Christianity where sin exists, and there's good reasons for God to allow suffering. And so it's a logical fallacy. And Roe conveniently ignores the Christian doctrines of sin and divine justice. And the Bible says that suffering exists because sin exists, and there are many reasons why God would allow suffering, even reasons that might seem meaningless, like the death of a fawn. The death of a fawn, the slow death of a fawn in a forest that no one knows about, could be the reason why 2 million people in China get saved 5,000 years in the future. You have absolutely no possible way of knowing the effect that one thing that happens now could have on the rest of eternity. But God does. And because God does, he would be justified in allowing anything to happen that he wanted to happen. If I were to die of a heart attack right now, for all I know, in 2,000 years, there's going to be a great revival that takes place in Nigeria, where 100 million people are saved and get to go to heaven because 1,000, 2,000 years in the past, some unknown preacher from Duke Oklahoma had a heart attack. You have no idea what the consequences, the long-term consequences of one small thing is. You ever hear that kind of reasoning where if somebody went back to the past and they stepped on a butterfly, and it would cause a tsunami to take place in India or something like that? And it's absolutely right. There's this ripple effect that takes place every time something happens. And the only one that would possibly know where all the ripples end up is God. And so he can allow anything that he wants to allow. And he's perfectly just in doing that. Now, finally, there's the matter of the emotional problem of evil. And it's called the emotional problem of evil because it's not logical. Okay? It is completely emotional. It is an unreasonable and irrational reaction to suffering, and it's something that we are all guilty of. Whenever something bad happens to me or something bad happens to you, sometimes we respond by faith, and that's good. And sometimes we don't respond by faith. Sometimes we just become completely irrational and inconsolable, and we lash out at God. It's usually associated with anger or grief. If someone is angry with God over the loss of a loved one, for example, they're probably not going to care about logically sound arguments because it's not a logical reaction. It's an emotional reaction. And so if I were to go to the hospital today and I would find maybe some family whose child just died of cancer, and I sat down with them and I said, hey, did you know that the Epicurus paradox does not prove that Christianity is untrue? Do you think that would help them at all? Do you think that they would care about my Epicurus paradox? This is an emotional problem. This kind of person needs to be comforted, right? They're dealing with a crisis and they need to be loved. The problem of evil is asking, why does this happen? But the emotional problem of evil is asking, why does this happen to me? Why did this happen to me? Why did God allow this? And there's no answer to that. I could never tell you why God allowed something to happen to you. These type of people are not looking for real answers. They're looking for comfort. And the reality is that probably some of us in this room have been here. We had been at some time in our life where we were having this emotional problem toward evil. Where we were very upset with God because we don't understand why he's allowing or tolerating what it is that he's tolerating. And the best that I can tell you is that Christ is not ignorant of what you're going through. He understands the things that you suffer because he suffered too when I was on this earth. Anything that you've suffered, Jesus suffered it too. He understands what you're going through. And he has promised that one day he's going to return and he's going to fix these things that are broken. He's going to make the crooked path straight. In the book of Revelation, John says, "Then I, John, saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, from God as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. God will wipe every tear away from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. But he who sat on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, write, for these words are true and faithful. And this is a promise from God that the things that you're suffering right now are going to be brought to an end. So, just in the conclusion there, the argument from suffering is the de facto, and the de facto form is easily the weakest argument that anyone has ever thought up against Christian belief. At the same time, it is the most successful argument that anyone has made against Christian belief. This is it. And so we talk about these other lessons we're going to look at. We're going to look at, what about dinosaurs? What about cavemen? What about fossils? What about the age of the earth? We're going to look at all that stuff. And I'm telling you, it does not get better than this as far as atheism goes. This is the best they have. This is it. This is the most successful argument. And it is easily, without contest, the weakest argument against Christian belief. And so it's really kind of disarming, isn't it? It's one of those things where it's like, really? That's the best you've got? Like, that's it? It's a very childish, very immature, overused argument that is easily debunked. Okay? It is a straw man argument. It fails to honestly interact with the idea that it contends with. It is a dishonest argument. It does not deal with what Christianity really believes about sin and about suffering and the existence of God. Instead, it makes up its own version of God, and it attacks that version of God. It's not actually interacting with Christianity. It is not a fair argument. Now, the de jure version of this argument is not much better, and it suffers from the same sort of weaknesses. It's also worth noting, by the way, that the problem from evil has been around longer than Christianity has. And if it was true, if it was successful, Christianity wouldn't be here today. It's really funny to me because, especially if you've ever had an online interaction with an atheist or a coworker at work, they will act like they know something that you just don't know. They'll laugh, oh, you're one of those dumb Christians. You don't even know that we've proven that God doesn't exist. Oh, really? Really? You've proven it, huh? Oh, yeah, I know something that you don't know. What is it? There's the problem of evil. Like, the problem of evil is like over 2,000 years old. Christianity is aware of the problem of evil. It does not defeat Christianity. It's not a new or original argument. And matter of fact, atheists don't even make that argument anymore because it's not a good argument. And so it's really kind of a silly thing. If it carried any serious weight at all, whatsoever, do you think that Christianity would still be here? Christians have been really suffering through history. They've been tortured, hunted, and killed for most of the history of the world. For most of the history of the world, Christians have wished that Christianity wasn't true so they wouldn't have to believe it. Do you think that that people enjoy being hunted and killed, and their families being hunted and killed? Do they continue anyway? Do you think that we had proven that Christianity wasn't true, that people would continue to be hunted, tortured, and killed for the thousands of years of Christian history that's gone on and still goes on today? It's obviously not. Now, on the other side of that, the emotional problem of evil, that's an entirely different matter. And probably even as a Christian, you're going to struggle with that. And maybe you're struggling with it right now. And I would just remember that whenever you feel hurt, Satan wants you to run away from God and not toward God. Don't fall for that. God is not the one who causes your pain. I would remember that. As a matter of fact, God is the one who's taking great efforts to end your pain and alleviate your pain. That's another one of our responses to the problem of evil. If God's so good, how come He hasn't stopped? How come He hasn't done something to put an end to human suffering? What's the answer to that?
He has.
He has done something at great cost to Himself to put an end to human suffering. He sent His Son to die on the cross. He suffered more than anybody else. And I love this verse from the Apostle Paul. You find in 1 Corinthians. He said, then comes the end when He delivers the kingdom to God the Father, and He puts an end to all rule and all authority and power, for He must reign till He has put all enemies under His feet. And the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. And God is going to put an end to suffering of every kind once and for all when He establishes His kingdom. Amen?